I want to thank Joseph Gerson, who's been a friend and a stalwart in the New England and even internationally in the broader peace movement. I know that he's working incessantly on these questions. I was invited to speak in New Hampshire tomorrow, and I wanted to come through Cambridge and meet with or exchange views with some activists on the way, all the way to UNH and St. Anselm, and then from there down to Washington, D.C. I'm glad to see so many of you showed up. If it's true that this is tough weather, it goes for you, not for me. It's easy for me. The first thing I want to do is just pass this around, if I can. Speaking of community organizing, I never leave a meeting without a yellow pad. I operate a newsletter which is attempts to get original information about this series of wars that I call the Long War. And it goes out to people in clusters where I've spoken around the country, probably 50 or 60 cities, including NATO countries, because they're the partnership that is actually the sponsor of the occupation. And I'd be delighted to just share my own analysis and information with you and hear from you. It's amazing what can be done online these days. I'm now starting to teach a class online on the war. The government of Egypt is being overthrown online. It's just it's such a fantastic change in the world that's been going on. I have been both in the streets and in elected office, and I often get the question, especially from students, how do you compare the inside to the outside? Which is the more effective approach? And after I tell them I don't actually know, that remains to be seen. The real answer is that, like many people, I began to be organized or be activated or energized by the problems that were invading my personal life. The treatment of students in the 1960s, for example, the example of the student civil rights movement in the South. I went down to Georgia, to Mississippi. I was a freedom rider, and the issues were domestic and rooted in slavery and historic, and I wasn't looking much farther than that. But at the very time that we had this tremendous opportunity at a gradual transformation here in the United States, 1964 summer, when the Mississippi Democrats were challenging the Democratic Party, it was at the same moment that the civil rights workers were mutilated and killed in Mississippi that at the time of their funeral, the discovery of their bodies, the first American planes were off bombing North Vietnam in the name of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. And that was a very heavy experience for me in the sense that for the first time I felt I had been interested in peace and disarmament and in changing our national priorities. And I've been inspired by the Stuart Hughes campaign in 1992 here in Massachusetts that tried to make disarmament a legitimate topic of American politics. But I was really focused on my generation and the events around me. And then to discover that the obstacle was not simply Southern racism and covert national acceptance of that racism, but it was actually the war in Vietnam, which would come to escalate over all of our lives and turn our energy away from Mississippi and away from Newark, where I was a community organizer, and devour the budget for the anti-poverty programs with the budget for Vietnam, which led by 1965 to the first riots or rebellions in cities. If you'll remember, there must have been 75 of these upheavals, all, I think, related somehow. We knew they were related to Vietnam, as well as to the failure on part of our government at every level to rapidly and effectively deal with the problem that had been around for hundreds of years, the problem of race. So I found myself feeling that I had to give up on community organizing at the time with the coming of Black Power and the coming of the Vietnam War. And I'm not going to explain the subsequent 40 years, only to say that I've been troubled by this problem of whether to work on foreign policy and wars of aggression and so forth, or domestic policy, and I've concluded that we all work where we are comfortable, where we feel that we fit. That's just in our nature. But I've seen again and again that the progression of wars has always robbed us of the ability to deal with our domestic problems fully and satisfactorily, and the wars come back in the form of the shootings of our leaders, the shootings most recently in Tucson of all those people. And so when I left the legislature, it just happened that I saw the initial phase of the bombing of Baghdad and the launching of that war, and at the same time the launching of yet another peace movement, a massive peace movement of millions of people in only a decade ago. And so ever since, I've been trying to be a participant, but kind of a participant writer and analyst, trying to understand where this war came from, and at the same time where the peace movement came from, because unlike many other movements that have permanent organizational form and mass dynamics, peace movements seem to rise, like it or not, at times of great fear or great American casualties, or the threat of casualties. If you think of the Freeze campaign that was so forcefully supported here in Cambridge and in New England. If you think of the solidarity movement with Central America, all the way from Vietnam to the present. So maybe I can offer some thoughts. I guess what I'm saying in a nutshell is that this war that we're now experiencing will come and go, it will flicker in our consciousness, just as in the past we've turned from one issue to another and back again to the original issue. We're preoccupied now primarily by the presidential politics, the rise of the Tea Party, the Wall Street scandal, the unemployment crisis, the failures of our economy, the possible debacle over health care. And what's an activist going to do? An activist is a volunteer. What's a person going to do? We only have so much capacity to focus on anything. We go from issue to issue, and sometimes there are just too many issues for anyone to stand out the way Vietnam did for a period of time. I believe these issues have to be interrelated, yes, but generally in my life, in organizing and intellectually in writing, I try to focus on a single issue. I don't know if you're the same way, but most people I know are part of the long single-issue history of protest in America. And often women's suffrage and abolition, people have the capacity to take 2 or 3. So I focused on this current war, knowing that it was going to be a theft of our future if it wasn't stopped. And it turns out there is an actual doctrine, a Pentagon doctrine, that's called the Long War. I don't think President Obama has officially endorsed the doctrine. One reason that there's not much attention paid to it, you can go to the longwarjournal.com. It's one of these little sites where everybody obsesses about their issue, and you'll find an amazing amount of material and literature about the Long War. Andrew Basevich, who's from around these parts, is one of the few authors who's edited a big book called The Long War. It appears in the counterinsurgency writings quite frequently as in the concept of Afghanistan or Iraq being a short war in the midst of a long one. That's the subtitle of a book by David Kilcullen, who is an Australian counterinsurgency expert and was the top advisor to General Petraeus in Iraq and is one of the leading authors. So the Long War has even crept into our legal terminology. One of the Bush appointees to the federal courts, right-wing conservative federal judge, I think in Virginia, has ruled in an actual case involving detainees that they should never be released until the Long War is over. In other words, if you pick somebody up on a battlefield in Afghanistan, the whole concept of doing their time and being released is ridiculous, she believes, because the Long War is the battlefield. Afghanistan or Iraq are only partial battlefields. So the Long War has crept into our society and into our culture without being discussed. The reason I think that it's not being discussed is people became pretty sour on Iraq, right? And the Long War says that the duration of the Long War will be between 50 years and 80 years. If you calculate, that's 20 presidential terms. That's multiple congressional 2-year cycles. That's a war far into the future that will affect the lives of people not yet born. And I don't think there's much public appetite in America for somebody advocating a 50-year war, which leads us immediately into the problem of secrecy, which is one of the byproducts of this kind of commitment. It's a war that cannot be spoken of. And so therefore, it's not really an accident that so much of our policies are now surrounded by secrecy. If you look at the cost of a 50 or 80-year conflict, we can debate it, but I think Stiglitz and Bilmes have put a $3 trillion price tag on the cost of Iraq, which will include veterans' health care. The war in Afghanistan will be a $1 trillion war by 2012 in direct costs, not counting the accrued cost of health care and the rest of it. So you're talking about 2 wars that are $6 trillion and not concluded and not paid for, generally speaking. You have Pakistan, which is a secret war, but is estimated to be $7 billion, billion, not trillion, billion on the so-called civilian side. the institution building, nation building side. And I don't know how much has been spent on Pakistan's army. I don't know how much has been spent on the special forces in their secret projects. But if you throw in another trillion, we're at 5 to 10 trillion unpaid for. And obviously you can't be a war hawk and a deficit hawk, right? Unless you just don't talk about it. You know, don't speak of it. But that's where we are. People ranting and raving about our deficits and turning over trillions of dollars for wars that are, you know, at best inconclusive. And others believe another bombing attack. So Congress tried, far more than this Congress, but Congress tried to end it. Congress was a factor. The public, the anti-war movement was driving Congress. It wasn't the other way around. But even then, there's something about the nature of our state that when it's in crisis, it doesn't heed public opinion very easily. It doesn't heed the will of Congress very easily. It doesn't heed the editorials. It reacts like on a reptilian basis to the threat to its existence, to the threat to its reputation, to the threat to its dominance. And Vietnam was lost to the state because of the North Vietnamese army and the Southern Liberation Front and Nixon's overreaction. I guess we could argue that our movement's very existence caused him to overreact. That might be a plausible scenario. Now, how does that apply to the current situation? I think this may sound like an unnecessary historical talk, but I'm convinced over 50 years of activism that the state has a better institutional memory than we do. And the state is always reacting on the basis of what it has learned from the past, while activist generations come and go. But it's the same state. It may have an African-American president, a more diverse complexion to the Congress, the Democratic Party, but it's the same. It's a Machiavellian state that has a single purpose, which is to expand its reputation and power over resources. And if it has to move in one direction to do that or another direction to do that, it will do so. So we have to keep that in mind. And it seems to me that the strategy could be this, that you want to apply local people power to the pillars that underlie the policy of the state. Republicans and people in the anti-war movement were pleased, just as anybody who's working and sees some result is apt to be pleased. It did seem to me that at the time I took the view that this might be the high water mark unless something terrible happens, because you've run out of liberal districts and the center-left districts, and the Republicans aren't moving. So we can say that's where we are going into this year. It's about half the Democrats in the House, and there are enough votes there if Obama wants to collaborate and depend on the Republicans who want to eliminate him. He can get the funding for the war only through that collaboration. So it's a dismal picture, I think, unless you take the view that it's a very long process. And I just want to add one other practical thought before I take your questions. One of the reasons I wanted to talk here was about Senator Kerry. Senator Kerry can play a role. Never mind that he doesn't or hasn't. It's always curtain time. It's a very, if you have the long view. Now, I remember Kerry demonstrating against the war, committing civil disobedience, and testifying before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that he now chairs. one of the better historical speeches. It will certainly go down as such. And now he's the chair. So I have known him for a very long time, and I occasionally talk to him, and I especially talk to his staff. He has some very, very good staff, and it's really bothered me that he's been supportive of this formula that Iraq was the bad war and Afghanistan is the good war. And once you get committed to that public position, then it becomes a process of how you reel somebody back in from a position they've taken. Have you ever done this in life where you get the most stubborn and the most difficult when you know something you're saying is wrong? You've discovered that it was wrong. Then you're worse than when you're open-minded or you're just wondering what's the right move. So I wrote him a letter, which I suppose I should post, a few months ago, just calling on him to do a shift in his position, because I think he occupies a strategic role in our history. Because of his anti-war past and chairing this committee, and because Obama followed the Kerry doctrine of bad war, good war into Afghanistan, Kerry is the principal person who could call for a change of national policy by admitting either that he was mistaken or by, I think this is an easier thing for him to say, simply saying that the test of Afghanistan has had, a decade and thousands of lives and trillions of dollars, so it's time for a reassessment. And as chair of this committee, he could call anti-war leaders to testify, as he was called to testify, and he could also initiate a national dialogue on rethinking Afghanistan in such a way that it creates the gravitational pull that allows Obama to get out. That's where I think Massachusetts is critical. We're going to get this done one way or another. I'm not here to guilt you or say you haven't done enough on Kerry. I'm just here as an outsider to say that I believe Kerry occupies a crucial position, if he chooses to exercise it, in helping lead the National Democrats and Obama out of Afghanistan. So anything that can be done, from sweet talk to protest, from rational dialogue to going to his office and complaining, you know the tactics. They've all been done before. But I do think that if you're looking at 2012, here's the situation. The Petraeus and the generals, I believe, want us to stay until they, quote, win, which means win something militarily for the prestige of the services. The contractors, similarly. They don't go for timelines. Kissinger famously remarked, generals don't do exit strategies. And Obama well knows that he will be accused of having lost Afghanistan. The most brutal refrain in American politics, who lost China, who lost Korea, who lost Vietnam, it will be repeated to the extent that he gets out with some kind of compromise formula like Laos, as opposed to getting out after winning. He's acknowledged this almost painfully in saying that there won't be a victory. Well, that's not what generals want to hear either. And Karl Rove, the Republicans, there are people in our circles who think we can get the Republicans to help on this. My guess is no. Despite the fact that they're concerned about deficits, despite the fact that Ron Paul has taken a consistent position against this war, there are very few Republicans who are going to do that. They're more typically inclined to lean to Karl Rove, who says he hasn't heard Obama set victory as the goal yet. So they're setting it up to support the war effort by Obama and vote for it and vote for the money, and then attack him if he tries to get out. So that's the difficulty he's in. I think that if there's a peace vote, it's not like the women's vote or the African American vote, but let's say there is a discernible peace bloc. Our colleague from the conference has written a book about public opinion on and voting on peace, and it surely is the difference between the president winning or losing in 2012. And it's not run by a central committee or a high command. It doesn't have an organization. But it's based on people's voluntary desire to participate, to vote, to raise money, to knock on doors, to make arguments, and to fight for a narrow victory or defeat in the 2012 election. So Obama is now facing this calendar, and then I'll end. He's going to begin withdrawing from Afghanistan this July. He may already know how many troops he's going to withdraw. We've got 100,000 there at the moment. And dovish national security people think he should withdraw 30 to 60,000 starting this July. So you start to get halfway out going into the 2012 election, and then withdraw the rest over the subsequent couple of years. Obama has, out of somebody's advice, said that all the troops will be gone, depending on conditions, by the end of 2014. That's re-elect me president and wait 2 years. But the only time we'll know is anything concrete is this July. The generals are calling for a token withdrawal, and the peace movement should be calling for a maximum withdrawal. Barbara Lee has legislation which will be fought over right all the way through July, which will allow the Congress, the Congress to vote and show a sign of numbers. The Democratic National Committee is meeting at the end of February, and Barbara Lee and others, I believe, will have an anti-war resolution to try to get the Democratic Party to go on record against the war in Afghanistan. And that will be quite a fight behind closed doors, I suppose. So any of you who have any inclination to put pressure on Congress and on DNC members from Massachusetts, please do so. John Burton, who's the head of the Democratic Party in California, is a very hardcore anti-war advocate and will do everything he can to help Lee or the others. But you can imagine the counter-argument will be, well, let's not embarrass the president, so let's not come out for an anti-war position. Same thing we heard in the 1960s. So there are these stopping points. The Lee bill and the DNC between now and July, then he announces how many he's going to withdraw, and he has to make a calculated judgment as to whether that will satisfy anybody. And so if you want to express dissatisfaction, I'm saying this is the strategic time to do so, this 6-month period. Then we'll see what it is. But there is a 6-month run-up to this announcement of how many troops are going to be withdrawn. And because we're not a tightly disciplined movement, he's going to have to convince each and every one of you to get your vote or to get your support. And the inducement is going to be how many troops he says he's going to initially withdraw. This is a high-risk situation, I understand. But I'll stop there on that practical note. And just in conclusion say, the good news is that if the American people ever heard about the long war, they would be horrified. The bad news is they'll never hear about it unless you make it known that these people in Washington and the Pentagon plan to go from war to war to war until every Muslim they don't like, apparently, is dead. As a matter of fact, this is what an Ivy League education will get you. Bruce Rydell, the chief advisor to Obama in the review at the Brookings Institution, actually said during the review, Mr. President, we have to keep killing them until they stop killing us. That's where we are. That's the thought process currently exhibited in Washington, D.C. Thanks very much.